The black SUV came screeching to a halt outside the skyscraper, its taillights illuminating the dark street corner. The car door swung open, and a silver-haired man jumped out. The air was thick with the smell of gun smoke, and the man paused briefly as the approaching police sirens wailed loudly through the silent streets. Helios squinted, his cold expression hardening. He passed through the torn wire and toppled barricades and entered the dark gray structure that now doubled as a quarantine zone. The residents inside the zone had been evacuated, and the only signs of movement were the whistling wind and the sound of his own footsteps. The expansive foyer was bathed in the cold glow of the emergency lights. The space was completely empty, but for shards of glass and spent shell casings. The blood spatter and smell of gun smoke still lingering in the air were proof of the terrible violence that had just occurred here. Helios walked to the center of the hall. The floor was completely covered in pools of blood. The smell was heavy and nauseating. His pupils contracted as he clenched his fists, and his breathing became erratic.
Am I too late?
His voice was low, as if speaking to himself. Police sirens blared, and flashing red lights flooded the area, reflecting off pieces of broken glass and Helios's grief-stricken eyes. A subordinate undercover in the quarantine zone had warned him of the gruesome spectacle, but nothing could have prepared him for the horror of seeing it with his own eyes. Before long, the sound of heavy footsteps marching in unison drew near. It was not difficult to guess who they belonged to. Unsurprised by their arrival, Helios ducked into the shadows, well out of sight. A team of heavily armed men appeared at the entrance. Ready for anything, they were on high alert, despite the absence of any immediate threat. A stately middle-aged man entered the foyer. He had all the appearance of a senior officer. Unmoved by the destruction, he scanned the room with a look of complete indifference. One of the soldiers approached him and saluted.
Commander, the quarantine zone has been secured.
The commander nodded, and his cold voice echoed in the silence.
Seal off the entire area. No one is allowed to enter. Round up any stragglers. I don't want any surprises.
Helios watched the man issuing orders. His cold eyes flashed in the darkness. As the men went about sealing off the building, he slipped out of the blood-stained hall undetected. Back inside the SUV, Helios took a few moments to compose himself. He stared blankly at the scene, unwittingly fiddling with a candy in a brightly colored wrapper. The colorful candy looked out of place in his hands. It gave him a somewhat softer appearance. Suddenly, Helios gripped the steering wheel, his face contorted in pain. A half-strangled groan escaped from between his clenched teeth. The brightly colored candy fell from his fingers into a dark recess. Moonlight shone through the window, illuminating his silver hair with a golden glow for an instant. He buried his face in his right elbow, and large beads of sweat formed on his brow, as if a kind of uncanny transformation was occurring.
Not now!
He howled hoarsely, his eyes now golden in the darkness. Residual power inside the quarantine zone appeared to be affecting him. Violent forces jolted the tiny space and coursed through his obsidian ring. Amid his pain, unfamiliar scenes flashed before his eyes. Somewhere in the snow, he lifted up his foot and placed it on the wall next to the girl. He looked into her tear-filled eyes and said,
Then you'd better figure out how to get strong.
A moment later, the scene shifted. He was pinned down under a hail of gunfire, fighting off some unknown adversary. A girl appeared and helped him to escape.
Is this what you want me to see?
He roared into the void, but the visions continued. A black box in the form of a pyramid emanated an extremely familiar power. He witnessed two people in a car crash, and just as the collision occurred, light burst forth from the box. In the final scene, the girl was trapped in a dark world. Countless portals opened in the sky, extending infinitely in all directions. He knew this place well. The Black Cabin. The taste of blood filled his mouth, and intense pain threatened to rob him of consciousness. An icy voice cut through his foggy thoughts.
Do not resist it.
Get out of my head!
Helios slammed the accelerator to the floor, and the SUV fishtailed down the street and into the night. The city and streets shifted and twisted, and the voice inside his mind grew louder and louder. As Helios put distance between himself and the quarantine zone, the pain in his body gradually began to dissipate. His cold eyes glanced up at his rearview mirror. Realizing that he was being followed, he sneered and spun the wheel, disappearing down a small side street. By the time his pursuers arrived at the alley, there was no sign of the black SUV. Helios aggressively kicked open the door. Light shone down from the dome of the assembly hall, illuminating the figures below. All eyes fell upon the late arrival. Helios was in no hurry. The echoes of his carefully measured footsteps weighed heavily, amplifying the mounting tension in the silent hall.
Let us begin.
Helios took his place at the end of the round table, his eyes scanning the 11 other seats. Of those in attendance, some submissively lowered their eyes. Others greeted his gaze with a look of defiance. Noticing the two empty seats, Helios sneered. Finally, a voice broke the silence.
Hades' reset plan has failed. Shouldn't we move into the final phase?
Before the man could finish, he was immediately refuted. Remember what happened 17 years ago. We should not waste our time on pointless endeavors.
But it is so close to completion.
His eyes glowed with a disturbing fanaticism.
At least get the test subjects back.
The other man sneered. To fall even one step short still constitutes a failure. The same goes for those amplification experiments. It was all doomed from the beginning. The man glanced furtively at the silent figure at the head of the table. Helios slouched in his seat, looking somewhat bored. He appeared neither pleased nor dissatisfied, his expression unreadable. Suddenly his eyes darted back at the man. The smile on his face was cruel.
What, you expect me to clap?
Helios clapped twice and his voice became cold.
Now cut the crap.
Another member of the circle stood up and raised a different issue.
We have seized experimental data from the Special Task Force relating to evolutionary acceleration. The data suggests the experiments are very likely to succeed, or in fact, have already succeeded.
He paused for a moment, hesitating.
I suspect Ares is somehow involved in their plan.
At once, the hall erupted into dissonance. Losing his patience, Helios stood abruptly, and everyone fell silent. He looked at each of them in turn, detecting a mixture of fear and vigilance in their eyes. They were unconvinced, but that was unimportant.
The new world you seek is already close at hand.
His voice carried an unspoken charm, and the golden light flashed in his eyes.
And now, we must prepare.
Satisfied, he observed the fervor in their eyes. He could hear the quickening of their heartbeats and the deepening of their breaths, just as he had anticipated.
As for the other matter, Black Swan does not require the services of defeatists or traitors.
Helios's tone was full of unconcealed warning. He then left as abruptly as he had arrived. The great doors slammed shut behind him. Passing through a corridor, Helios spied a familiar figure. He walked over, stopping in the shadows a few feet away.
Ares.
The man turned to face him. He was wearing a white windbreaker and his expression was gentle, as if he was using another persona. But it was merely a pretense.
Did your plan succeed?
Ares' question sounded more like a statement, so Helios decided to change the subject.
I've heard things.
This clearly piqued Ares' attention. Helios sneered.
They're saying you took part in Special Task Force experiments.
Ares laughed lightly, yet his expression remained measured. His cruel eyes were bottomless pits, and all traces of Lucien were momentarily extinguished.
It seems our collaboration has proven successful.
Of course.
Helios continued down the corridor. Their distaste for one another was palpable.
Professor.
There are many things in life that can fuel ambition. Helios was not surprised in the slightest that people were plotting against him, just as he had done to his predecessor. After all, the new world was like a newly discovered mine, and anyone could catch gold fever. Except for the buzzing of the mainframe and clattering of keyboard keys, the empty room was completely silent. Helios's fingers flew across the keyboard, countless lines of code filling the screen. His lips were pressed tight, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his brow, though he was too preoccupied to notice. He finally hit the Enter key. The progress bar popped up and began crawling forward imperceptibly. It read 0.01%. Helios breathed in a long sigh of relief and took a sip of his soda. His eyes glowed with the satisfaction of a job well done. He stood up and stretched his stiff lower back.
If only there was someone I could share this with.
He lobbed the empty bottle into the trash can in the corner and whispered.
When are you coming back?
No one was there to answer, but he didn't care. Helios had half a mind to attend another meeting, if only to listen to their arguments, hear the cruelty behind their words, and see the excitement on their faces and the savior-like fervor in their eyes. Everything was proceeding as planned. The invisible hands pulled the strings behind the scenes, making puppets dance to fate's inescapable tune. By the time he returned, the progress bar had slowly reached 98%. As he watched the bar reach 99%, Helios suddenly dropped to his knees, doubling over, as the pain from the evil storm raged inside him, rendering him speechless. A long, absent light shone in his eyes. He stared intently at the screen and chuckled quietly to himself.
So that's it.
The progress bar reached 100%. The screen flashed twice and went black. Gasping from the pain, Helios picked up his phone. A blonde-haired boy was reflected on the screen. Switching screens, the wallpaper image was that of a girl holding a little bear.
It's time.
Helios's voice was very quiet, his eyes soft. He stroked the face of the girl on the screen with his fingertip. He tapped on her number and sent a text. "Welcome back." He paused for a moment and added a little emoji.